Today, we are pulling a really fascinating moment out of the archives. It's the U.S. presidential election of 1908.
Yeah, it might not be the first election that jumps to mind for most people, maybe lacks some of the, let's say, obvious fireworks of others.
Right.
But looking through this stack of articles and research we have for this deep dive, it's just so clear. 1908 was a profoundly crucial transition point.
Absolutely. So we've got these sources laid out. And our mission, really, is to pull out those key nuggets, the main insights. We want to understand what made 1908 so significant, and maybe what it tells us about that time that, well, still echoes today.
It really does set the stage for so much of the political drama that came next. It's foundational in a way.
Okay, so let's paint the picture. 1908, the air is kind of thick with this progressive era energy, right?
Yeah.
And just dominating the whole scene is the incumbent, Theodore Roosevelt.
Right. I mean, the sources consistently describe him as this larger-than-life figure. The trustbuster.
Yeah.
The guy behind the square deal, the speak softly and carry a big stick mantra. He'd been president for nearly 2 full terms, came in after McKinley in '01, then won big in '04.
Landslide.
Huge landslide. And the research is unanimous. He was incredibly popular.
Yes, wildly popular. So the big question is, why wasn't he running again? The sources all point back to that public statement he made.
The pledge not to seek a third term, following Washington's example.
Exactly, that tradition.
Although what's really interesting is how some of these sources kind of debate whether he really meant that back in 1904 when he first said it.
Yeah. Did he regret it later?
Maybe. But regardless, by '08, he wasn't officially running, so the Republicans needed a successor. But, I mean, his shadow loomed large, very large.
And that's where William Howard Taft enters the picture. How do the sources characterize his relationship with Roosevelt? Were they close?
Oh, yeah. Very close, according to everything we've read. Taft was his Secretary of War, a personal friend, someone apparently admired a lot for his legal mind, trusted him completely.
Right.
And Roosevelt, these articles argue, basically saw Taft as the perfect guy to carry on his progressive policies.
To keep the momentum going.
Exactly. Continue the fight against monopolies, expand that whole square deal idea.
And the square deal, just to remind ourselves from the sources, that was about trying to balance things out, right? Between business, labor, the public.
Yeah, sort of mediating. Conservation was key, controlling corporations, protecting consumers, making sure everybody got a fair shake in this new industrial America.
Okay, so Roosevelt sees Taft as the continuation. How involved was TR in actually getting him nominated?
Deeply involved. The sources really paint a vivid picture here. One article we looked at described the Republican convention in Chicago. It said it felt less like a real contest and more like a coronation.
Wow.
Yeah, like it was totally engineered by Roosevelt's influence from behind the scenes.
So it sounds less like an endorsement and more like TR basically installed Taft. Is that fair?
That's certainly the sense you get from reading this research, yeah. The Republican platform for 1908, it just reads like a Roosevelt checklist.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Stronger corporate regulation, conservation, labor reforms, cracking down on child labor. It was basically designed to let Taft extend the Roosevelt presidency.
But the Democrats, they weren't just going to roll over. They brought back a very familiar face, William Jennings Bryan.
The great commoner himself, making his 3rd run for the White House, lost in '96, lost in 1900.
Third time's a charm. Or maybe not.
Well, the sources really emphasize his incredible skill as an orator. I mean, the man could hold a crowd like almost no one else back then. Just captivating.
And he was really pushing for the working class, for farmers, right?
Yeah.
Always hammering away at the power of big business, the monopolies.
Absolutely. He was the voice saying the government needed to step in, really intervene on behalf of the little guy, the ordinary American.
And this is where it gets interesting, looking at the sources. You see these different flavors of progressivism, don't you?
Totally. Both Bryan and the sort of Roosevelt-Taft Republicans, they shared some core progressive ideas like, yeah, corporate power needs limits, social injustices need addressing.
Right. Common ground there.
But their solutions and how much government should do, that's where they really diverged significantly.
Bryan's platform, according to what we've read, it was pretty radical for its day.
Yeah.
What were some specifics the sources highlighted?
Oh, yeah. Bryan was pushing for things that sound maybe less startling now, but were revolutionary then, like government ownership of railroads.
Wow, okay.
Much tougher trust busting than even TR was doing. A national income tax, remember, that didn't exist yet.
Right, pre-16th Amendment.
Exactly, and the direct election of senators. Back then, state legislatures picked them.
And the sources explain why that felt so radical to people at the time.
Yeah, they do. They talk about the fears people had about, centralizing too much power in Washington, concerns about the government messing too much with private business. It was a fundamental debate about the relationship between citizens and the federal government.
So Bryan's ideas felt like a much bigger structural change compared to the sort of regulatory path that Roosevelt and Taft preferred.
That's a good way to put it. Taft was offering this continuation, maybe a more moderate, progressive path. Bryan was the old populist warrior calling for something deeper, more transformative, a real battle of progressive visions.
Fascinating.
And the campaign itself, the sources say, was just, well, it was something else. Because even though TR wasn't running, he was everywhere. His presence just loomed.
How did that actually play out on the trail?
Well, Taft, the sources describe him as, capable, competent, but definitely lacking the sort of star power of TR or Bryan.
Not the same charisma.
Not at all. But he traveled like crazy, crisscrossed the country, trying to lay out his own vision, but always, always reminding voters, hey, I'm TR's guy, I'm his legacy. He had to prove he wasn't just a placeholder.
He had a tough balancing act.
For sure. Meanwhile, Bryan, he was totally in his element. One source described him basically living on a train.
Wow.
Just giving speech after passionate speech. Whistle-stop tours, huge crowds hanging on his every word. He was attacking the money power, trying hard to paint Taft as a puppet.
A puppet of the interests TR fought against.
Exactly. Trying to frame Taft as, like, a conservative wearing progressive clothing.
And the media. The papers must have had a field day.
Oh, absolutely. The sources stress how huge the media's role was. Newspapers back then were fiercely partisan. Like, one article mentioned the New York Tribune just relentlessly attacked Bryan, while others, maybe some owned by William Randolph Hearst, sometimes leaned towards Bryan. But it wasn't like he had the whole Democratic press unified behind him either. And the political cartoons, they were everywhere.
Oh, I bet. The cartoons from that era are amazing.
Yeah.
What did the sources say about how they depicted the candidates?
They were fantastic. Sources mentioned tons of cartoons showing Roosevelt as this kingmaker, literally pulling Taft's strings like a puppet master at the convention.
Classic.
Yeah. And Bryan was often shown as this, like, tireless crusader, maybe a bit like Don Quixote, tilting at windmills. Persistent, but maybe facing impossible odds.
So what were the main issues they were actually debating out there?
Okay, so continued regulation of trusts. That was huge. The tariff was another big one, always controversial. Should it go up, down, be reformed?
Always the tariff.
Always. Labor rights, conservation stuff Roosevelt had put on the map. They debated those too. And underneath it all was that fundamental question. What's the government's role supposed to be in this modernizing, industrializing society? Both guys tried to frame themselves as the champion of the average person against the powerful few.
Okay, so fast forward. Election day, November 1908. What were the predictions saying? Do they have polling like we do?
They had some limited polling, yeah. And the sources indicate it generally pointed towards a Republican win. There was this feeling, it seems, that while people liked the progressive direction,
Yeah.
they maybe weren't ready for Bryan's more radical, maybe more disruptive vision. And crucially, everyone saw Roosevelt's endorsement of Taft as carrying enormous weight, just huge.
And the results reflected that. Taft won.
Decisively. Yeah, Taft got 321 electoral votes. Bryan only managed 162.
Wow, that's a big gap.
It was, and the popular vote showed it too. About 7.6 million for Taft, around 6.4 million for Bryan, a comfortable Republican victory.
So when we look back through these sources, what does that win really signify? What was the message?
Well, the main thing that jumps out is that it signaled the public wanted to continue down that progressive path Roosevelt had started.
But maybe not quite as intensely as Bryan wanted.
Exactly. Maybe a version that felt a bit less confrontational, a bit less radical than what Bryan was offering. A preference for stability, perhaps, while still moving forward.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. Thinking about all the material we've gone through for this deep dive on 1908, what are the really key takeaways?
Well, for me, I think takeaway number one has to be the sheer enduring power of a popular president, even when he's not actually running.
Right. That's takeaway one. Theodore Roosevelt's influence. The sources make it crystal clear. He wasn't just a factor. He was arguably the driving force behind Taft getting nominated and winning.
Absolutely. It's a powerful lesson in how a president can shape the political future, the succession, even after stepping aside.
Okay, what's takeaway 2?
Takeaway two, I think, is about the nature of the progressive movement itself at that moment. This election really presented voters with two distinct paths within progressivism
Taft's more moderate continuation.
versus Bryan's more radical, maybe more transformative vision. And in 1908, the public chose the first option. It really highlights the internal debates and different ideas bubbling under the surface of that broad movement.
And takeaway 3. This one I find really interesting because it points directly to what happened next.
Yes. This election wasn't the end of the story. It was almost like setting the fuse. The very relationship between Roosevelt and Taft, the thing that defined this election, it would just completely implode later.
Spectacularly implode.
Totally. And that collapse, that fallout, it led directly to the huge split in the Republican Party in 1912. Roosevelt forms the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party.
And it completely changes the dynamics of that next election, letting Wilson win.
Precisely. So if you look at the big picture, 1908 wasn't really about solving the era's big issues. It was more like a pause, maybe, before those tensions really blew up.
It's a great reminder, isn't it? That elections which seem less dramatic on the surface can actually hold the seeds for really profound, long-lasting changes. They shape where political movements go. They set up future battles.
Definitely. Going through these sources, it really sharpens the focus on this pivotal but, yeah, often kind of overlooked moment in American history.
It really does. And it leaves you with some interesting things to chew on, doesn't it? Like, think about today. How does that dynamic play out now? Between a popular outgoing leader's influence and their chosen successor's campaign?
It's a good question.
Or how do different visions within a big political movement like progressivism back then still fight it out for public support and end up defining where that movement heads next?
Yeah, those are definitely questions worth thinking about long after the votes are counted in any election.